and welcome to this special edition of Broadcast on WION. My name is Mohammed Saleh. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to launch a ground offensive into Gaza's southernmost town of Rafah, with or without a truce deal to halt the fighting and to secure the release of hostages from Hamas. Now, despite the Israeli offensive having gone on for almost about 7 months, the question, of course, is why has the Israeli government so far failed in securing the release of hostages? And more importantly, does the Netanyahu government even have a plan to secure the release of hostages? Now, to tell us more about these issues and more, we're being joined by Ms. Helit Barel, who is the former director at Israel's National Security Council. Ms. Barel, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION. And let me actually ask you this question that everyone is talking about. Now, as we speak at this moment, there are hectic negotiations that are underway to try and reach some kind of a truce deal for a ceasefire and also for the release of hostages from the custody of Hamas. But Netanyahu's statement that he'll go ahead with an offensive on Rafah with or without a truce deal. What do you make of this statement by the Israeli Prime Minister?
Well, it's very hard to be conclusive about it, since these statements about close by attack, nearby in terms of time on Rafah have been, heard before. We've been hearing them certainly since February. So it's been a while that we've been hearing these statements. So at this point, it's hard to tell if these are negotiation tactics or if it's something that will actually take place. But I do have to qualify that by saying the issue of Rafah is certainly an issue that needs to be dealt with. It is how Hamas has amassed its capabilities. And so it is not unlikely that such an attack is imminent.
All right, we'll talk about, this offensive on Rafah in just a moment. But first, to talk about the hostages that are still in the custody of Hamas. The fact that the Israeli offensive has gone on for well over 6+ months, and still the Israeli military has not been able to secure the release of the hostages on the custody of Hamas. How do you think the Israeli defense forces are looking at their own operations in the Gaza Strip? Because the Gaza Strip is not a very large patch of territory. It's said to be smaller than, let's say, a city of New York. But as part of that, they've not been able to find the hostages. How is Israel proceeding on this front in trying to secure the release of hostages? Do they have to negotiate to get the hostages, or can they do it through a military operation?
Well, I think you gave a very good example with saying, it would be like a small part of New York. But consider what it would be for someone to occupy a small part of New York and to find a few, 40 people somewhere within huge buildings, and in this case as well, underground metro. And also, in terms of conducting a hostage operation, of course, we know that Sinwar is using the hostages to shield himself, as he uses Gazans to shield himself. So from a standpoint of a military operation, from the beginning, I don't think the goal was to physically extract them through a military operation. The goal was to exert such pressure militarily that they would be negotiating to then release the hostages. We did have a couple of successful military releases of the hostages, but because of the sheer number of the hostages, I think it would be impossible to release them by military operation. And I don't think anybody really had the expectation. The expectation was exerting the pressure would lead to a stronger position in negotiating. And there were periods where that worked. The first hostage deal certainly came because of strong military pressure from the IDF. Now, in terms of the IDF capacity and willingness to stay on and finish the job, I think they're absolutely there. The question again is, what's the cost? What time does it take? And do our hostages have that time?
Right, now you've been a former director of the Israeli National Security Council. So tell us what is in fact going through, in terms of this strategy here. Now, Israel, as a part of its military strategy, has said that it wants to destroy the underground tunnel network within the Gaza Strip. Now, Hamas has also said that it is hiding a lot of the Israeli hostages in these very tunnels. And the fact that the Israelis have been dropping these big bunker buster bombs on the tunnels where Hamas has been hiding not just its own people, but even the Israeli hostages. How many of the hostages do you think, realistically speaking, are still alive in the custody of Hamas?
I really have no way of assessing that. I'm hoping as many as possible. We know that it's far less than 133, which is the official number. We know that quite a bit of that are bodies, but our hopes are that we have, as many come back to us alive, if not necessarily with sound health. Having said that, this is exactly the reason why Israel has to be so careful in its military actions within Gaza. Clearly, if there were not hostages there, it would be a completely different scenario and script. So the issue of what Israel does militarily in Gaza, of course, is painted by the fact that hostages are there. But I have to repeat, the underground metro of Hamas, one way or another, whether it's now before the hostages are released or over the years to come, whether it's Israel doing it or with cooperation from Egypt and the United States, has to be dealt with. Hamas will not have once more a free flow of supplies to rebuild its might in the Gaza Strip or anywhere else. So we're dealing here with balancing some very, very vital interests, all of them in a very heightened situation. It's a complicated situation. I think most of the public, though, would agree the hostages come first.
Right. Now, the last time there was this exchange of hostages for the Palestinian prisoners was in November, December. It's been more than 4-5 months since the last hostages were released by Hamas. There is an increasing criticism of the Netanyahu government that he is not willing to negotiate with Hamas to secure the release of hostages, and that he can do more in terms of negotiations to secure the release of hostages, because militarily that objective has not been achieved. Do you think that's the argument that's being put forth by a lot of the people who are at this moment protesting within Israeli cities such as in Tel Aviv, where they're saying that Netanyahu must negotiate with Hamas, secure the release of the hostages, and then perhaps proceed with his military offensive against Hamas?
There's definitely a strong narrative that not enough has been done, and that deals were on the table earlier on that should have been negotiated more strenuously, and that concessions that are being made now should have been done 2 months ago, etc. Certainly, the public sentiment is such that this needs to be done with, that the hostages need to be returned, be the price, whatever it is. But we have to remember, Netanyahu has a government that relies on a fraction, on a very right-wing fraction that has stated that they reject whatever deal is on the table at the moment. They reject any deal that will require postponing or avoiding a Rafah offensive at this time. Certainly, they would refuse anything that is a permanent ceasefire, a sentiment that is probably more larger shared in the public, because we're still under threat. We have not eliminated the threat or even achieved the goals that would allow us to live with it. So politically, Netanyahu is in a difficult situation. But in terms of public sentiment and public support, I think it's clear the vast majority believe more should have been done. 6 months, the amount of time, more than 6 months, the amount of time these hostages are being tortured and held by Hamas is unacceptable. These are people that were taken from their beds, from parties, from their homes due to a failure in intelligence. And the state must do whatever it must do to return them is definitely the sentiment that you're hearing, not just in the demonstrations in Tel Aviv, but it is widely supported.
You know, and coming back to the statement that Netanyahu has made that he will go ahead with the Rafah offensive with or without a truce deal, is he resorting to this rhetoric only to keep his political career alive? Because the minute he says that he'll do a deal with Hamas and negotiate to secure the release of hostages and call in for a ceasefire, that means that would be at least a temporary end to this war, which could also mean the end of his tenure as the Prime Minister at the moment.
Well, I think he's in a bind either way, I must tell you. Certainly, we heard yesterday the right-wing fractions of his government, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who stated straight up that he had a government meeting with the Prime Minister and said that if the offensive doesn't go through and if this deal is signed, he's leaving the government, which would result, obviously, in this in a huge problem for Netanyahu. On the other hand, we also heard Gadi Eisenkot from the other side saying that if there are any political calculations rather than factual and security calculations around this hostage deal that are clouding the decision-making, he will be leaving, and then likely Benny Gantz would be leaving with him, which would leave Netanyahu in a big problem from the other side. It would leave supposedly his government intact, but it would leave the country in mayhem and politically very undesirable for him. Throwing into this is also the support that Yair Lapid, who is still the head of opposition, has offered from outside the government for a hostage deal. In other words, if they threaten to overthrow your government, I will support you from outside the government, bring the hostages back. So Netanyahu is going to have to make some very tough decisions. He doesn't like to do it. And he's under political pressure from both sides.
Right. Now, my final question to you is this. Now, the United States has said that an offensive on Rafah is a red line. This is something that Joe Biden has been saying over and over again. Do you think Netanyahu can go against Joe Biden and carry out the offensive that he's been saying that he wants to carry out in Rafah?
I think it would be very difficult, and I think it would be very costly for him to go up against Joe Biden, a U.S. president who has done really quite a bit for Israel from the beginning of the war. That doesn't mean it can't be done or that he won't do it, but it would be difficult for him to carry it out and maintain other efforts that are going on. So I think that's a big downside of an assault at this time. And I think it's also important to note that the American administration, Joe Biden and everybody else, state very clearly that they understand the problem in Rafah. They're not against an assault in and of itself. They're not against dealing with the problem of Rafah. They are against doing it at this time with the population, the civilian population still there. They are suggesting other ways to deal with it. We don't really know to detail what those are, but the understanding, I think, in the United States is strong that Rafah will have to be dealt with. They are against an assault at this time with the population still there, for sure.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Helit Barel, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
Thanks for having me.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.